The 20 gauge, hidden gem in the survival firearms world, or scrawny soy boy gauge. Not man enough to be considered amongst the real shotgunners that shoot 12 gauge. What's the real straight dope on the 20 gauge? Well, that's what we're going to talk about today on Gunfighter Life. Welcome to the podcast where we talk about guns, gunfighting, tactics, ballistics the right way with God Almighty at the center, biblical Judeo-Christian values, and real-world first-hand experience. On that, military, law enforcement, private security contracting, firearms instruction, long time hunter, guiding, a bunch of other stuff, bullet points in the show notes. That's why it's called Gunfighter Life. I have been blessed to survive a life of professional gunfighting, more or less. I'm blessed to be able to protect and provide for my family with a Bible and a gun. I don't apologize for that. Anyway, today's topic is the 20 gauge. Real quick, because if you've heard this a million times, you know this, that's cool. But you got to remember, people get into guns all different times. This could be somebody's just dipping their toe into the world of shotgunning. Shotgun gauge is a measurement. It's not one of those newfangled, effeminate French measurements like the metric system, right? It's a real old school measurement. And it is the number of lead balls of that diameter that would equal 1 pound. 12 lead balls equal 1 pound in a 12 gauge. 20 lead balls of that bore diameter equal 1 pound in a 20 gauge. This is kind of a good measurement, a no-nonsense measurement. You can kind of picture that in your head, hopefully, if you're familiar with lead. If you deal in lead as part of your trade, as like a journeyman gunfighter, or somebody that deals in lead or is familiar with bullets and ballistics, that kind of makes sense. And you can kind of picture in your head the difference that it would take to go from 12 lead balls to 20 lead balls in a pound if you put them in a pile, kind of the difference in size. So that's the 20 gauge. It's not exactly this, but a 12 gauge, if you want to think of it in caliber, which is a fraction of an inch, right? 50 caliber is half an inch. 25 caliber is a quarter of an inch. Easy. 12 gauge is something like 72 caliber, and that's not exact, but it's around 72 caliber, and 20 gauge is around 62 caliber. Here is the main thing that I want to get across. For what most people do with a shotgun, where most people live, the 20 gauge is way more than enough for the vast majority of things they're ever going to do. It is still overkill for most things. And some people will scoff at that, but some people think that you need to hunt deer with a 300 Win Mag. Now, if you want to hunt deer with like white-tailed deer with a 300 Win Mag, go ahead. But I think it's a ridiculous argument to think that you need a 300 Win Mag. You just do it because you want to, which is fine. But then somebody comes along with a 338 Win Mag and says, the 300 Win Mag is underpowered compared to the 338 Win Mag. And that's valid. It is underpowered compared to a 338 Win Mag. But if you're hunting white-tailed deer, both of those are way overkill for what you're doing. This is kind of the same thing with a 12 gauge and a 20 gauge. Both of those are way more power than you're going to need for defense against people at reasonable ranges. The accuracy of a 12 gauge with a slug or a 20 gauge with a slug, I'm talking a versatile shotgun, a smooth bore with a Foster slug or a Bernanke slug. The lethality of that projectile is far, far greater than the accuracy or trajectory potential of those weapons. They're more than enough power for defense, even with buckshot loads. They're more than enough power for any defensive use, and they're exponentially greater. We'll get into some numbers later, but exponentially greater than your PCC, your hashtag me too, I have a long gun and it's a PCC. Exponentially more powerful than that. Far more powerful than you need for that. And for deer hunting. I forget when I first took my first deer with buckshot with a 20 gauge. I could probably deduce it if I looked at some old pictures. But I was young. Is 20 gauge as powerful as 12 gauge? Not usually. Generally, fair comparisons, it's not as powerful. Sometimes it can be more powerful depending on the load. If you get a weak sauce load in a 12 gauge and a potent magnum load in a 20 gauge, it can be more powerful than a 12 gauge. Go look at the numbers for yourself. But in general, if you're comparing a general field load to a general field load or a 3-inch magnum to a 3-inch magnum, no, it's not as powerful. But both are probably much more power than you're ever going to need. Why is the 12 gauge so popular? Well, because it's been the number one gauge since the black powder era. The reason it's so big is the technology was a lot cruder back then. Black powder takes up a lot more volume than smokeless powder. If you look at a dram equivalent, which I think is a 1/16 of an ounce, but it's much smaller than that if you go to smokeless powder. If you look at wad technology, we have high tech, meaning like 100-year-old at this point, plastic. Like plastics are pretty old at this point. But those wads, a lot of those have big gaps in there to fill up the space in a 12 gauge. Why? Because when these were the old school black powder, very old technology 12 gauge, they would use paper or cotton or something like that as wadding. Before, plastic shells and common crimping, they would even use overshot wads. So all that adds up to the shell having to be much bigger than it probably would have to be today. But because the 12 gauge is so popular, it just stuck around. It's much bigger than it needs to be. That said, I'm a 12 gauge guy. I am a big fan of the 12 gauge, and I don't plan on replacing all my arsenal of 12 gauge with 20 gauge. It's kind of a common caliber. It's by far the most common. When I did a quick search, it was something like twice as many loads available when I did a search at Midway USA. I'm not sponsored by Midway USA. I just use them a lot for buying ammo and gun parts and things like that. I've used them for years. Used them so long that my password is my old L.A.P.D badge and employee number. That's how old that account is that I've been using for Midway. In fact, when I go back, when you do like a background check, if you do private security contracting or something like that for the government, you'll know how much joy it is to go through a background investigation. And part of the things they need is old addresses. Well, the thing that I use for that is my Midway USA account, because pretty much everywhere I've lived, even if it's for a short amount of time, I've probably ordered something from Midway USA, and they keep all my old addresses. So even though they don't intend it for that, it's really handy for that if you're doing a background check. Consider that a tactical tip if you're getting a security clearance. But I got off track. Where was I going with that? Oh, when I did an ammo availability search, I did ammo available in 12 gauge and 20 gauge, and it was about double the amount of different loads listed for the 12 gauge as the 20 gauge. It's more popular. It's also generally going to be the cheapest unless you just get something on sale. So it's as or more affordable than a 20 gauge. It's more powerful, and it's more available. So for a survivalist, that makes a lot of sense. I've said that extra power is not really needed for defense against humans. It's not really needed for hunting white-tailed deer. Where it may come in handy is for bird hunting. And you might think, well, that's ridiculous. Deer are much bigger than birds. Yeah, but you don't hunt them the same way. If you're talking about shooting birds off the wing at distance, especially if you're in, some kind of hunting where they regulate that you don't use real ammo, you have to use steel shot instead of actual lead. Steel is a lot less dense, so you need more of it. So something like that, if you, waterfowl hunting where you have to use steel shot, I'm not saying I agree with that, but I'm saying it is, then yeah, you get a real advantage out of a 12 gauge. Right? So I'm not saying there's never an advantage in the 12 gauge as far as power goes, but don't think that you need that all the time. But it is the most available, the most affordable. And if you talk about tactical loads, well, they do make some decent tactical loads for the 20 gauge. But by and large, tactical shotguns is a 12 gauge arena, right? That's the world that it lives in. Military, law enforcement, they have that, and that's been a thing since the 1897 trench shotgun, right? And it was just 12 gauge. And again, you could argue whether we need that today or we could use a smaller gauge because we have much better technology and powder and things like, nickel-plated buckshot and things like that, better wads, smaller wads. You could argue that the 20 gauge of today is as good as those old 12 gauge shells. And that might be a valid argument. But the fact is that the 12 gauge has remained the dominant force in military law enforcement circles. Which brings me to my next point, shotgun availability. There are a lot of 20 gauges. 20 gauge is the second most popular. I haven't looked this up, but almost certainly the second most popular gauge. But a lot of the ammunition and a lot of the guns are set up as hunting shotguns for bird hunting. It's real popular for that, much smaller, lighter, handier gun. Which has its advantages in general survival shotgunning as well. But the vast majority of tactical shotguns are going to be in 12 gauge. Not all, there are some. But it's tough, right? My idea of a good versatile survival shotgun, which I've talked about before, is interchangeable chokes and good iron sights and the ability to mount optics. Now, if you're just, hashtag me too, I have a tactical looking shotgun and you just want to have one, and you're not actually going to use it, or you have one just for in your bedroom, the bead is fine. Your tactical heat shielded shotgun with no chokes and just a bead front sight, your hashtag me too sight. You point in a general direction and hope for the best, I guess. Okay, for that, whatever. But if you're talking about taking it outside your bedroom, yeah, having chokes are a real thing. They're not a gimmick. They're not a fad, right? Chokes are a real thing. Having a shotgun that takes chokes and having one that has actual sights to be aimed. Again, unless we're talking about bird hunting, aiming, that's kind of a big deal, right? Aiming is not a fad either. So one with actual sights, actual chokes, removable chokes, interchangeable chokes, kind of a big part of the versatility of the shotgun. And it's 2025, the ability to mount optics. That's hard to find on a 12 gauge. It's much harder to find on a 20 gauge, especially if you throw out all the Turk nasty clones like, oh yeah, look, let's give money to a bunch of people that want to cut our heads off, take your women and kill you, and give you the choice of Islam or die. I'm not about giving money to those people, so I'm not really about any of those shotguns. If you take those off the table, there's really not a lot left in the general purpose survival shotgun world. It can be done. I'm not saying that it can't, but it's a lot harder to get what I would call a general purpose survival shotgun in a 20 gauge and a 12 gauge. If we're just being honest here, the main drawback for me is not the power. And the 20 gauge has some real advantages. One of the things I did recently is I did some survival math in ounces, weight comparison. I try and do all kinds of stuff for the patrons, the guys that step up and support the podcast. One of the things I did last night was do a comparison on weight. I used a food scale to compare the weight of different ammo, all kinds of popular survival calibers, 223, 22 long rifle, 308. Anyway, for this discussion, because I'm not going to share all that with you because it's for the patrons, but I compared pretty similar buckshot, 9 pellet double aught buck for the 12 gauge and 9 pellet number 3 buck for the 20 gauge. Pretty comparable loads, 2 3/4 inch, almost identical velocities. And again, both of those are more than capable against people or whitetail deer. But the weight of a box of 25 rounds of the 12 gauge was 41.23 ounces, right? And for the 20 gauge, it's 28.11 ounces. So if we get rid of we just forget about the fractions, the decimal point. We go from 28 to 41. That's a big difference, especially when you consider the 20 gauge is powerful enough. I don't think anybody with 9 spheres of lead of number 3 buck is going to argue with you much longer. If you don't think that's enough, I'd have to look it up, but I don't know the diameter of number 3 buck, but it's larger than number 4 buck, and I believe number 4 buck is 24 caliber. You're looking at, 1,300 feet a second? That's about the velocity of a 22 long rifle out of something like a Ruger 1022. Consider roughly the same size, weight, velocity of like CCI Mini Mag solids out of a 1022. Not the best round per round survival round. I'll grant you that. But imagine dumping 9 rounds of that into somebody's torso, not quickly, all at once. 9 rounds of 22 long rifle hitting somebody in the chest at the same time, and tell me that's not enough. It's certainly enough. So the big advantage there is you're getting the same amount of rounds that are more than capable enough for 28 ounces versus 40-something ounces. That's a significant weight savings. It's also a significant size saving. So if you're carrying it in a pack in a bug-out bag, it's going to take up a lot less space, which gives you more space to carry other stuff, because survival is not all about guns. I know the subtitle of Gunfighter Life is survival guns, but there's a lot more to survival, right? You could have all the ammo in the world, and if you don't have water, you're going to die. So you can't shoot your way into water, right? So, there's a lot of other stuff that goes into survival. You could have all the ammo in the world and die of dysentery, right? So there's other things you need to carry. The less weight and size of the 20 gauge is a real advantage. Okay, I think this is a good transition point. I looked up some loads. That one that I mentioned, 9 pellet, number 3 buck, at 1345 feet per second. That's pretty close to what a lot of 12 gauge buckshot loads are, except you're going to get 9 pellets of double aught buck. It's a decent load. Let's look at some other real common loads. For a 12 gauge, generally, a hot load for, not even hot, a standard load for hunting for a 12 gauge slug is going to be a 1 ounce slug at 1,600 feet a second. And it might be 1610 or 60, or slightly more, slightly less than that. But I like round numbers when it doesn't really matter. We're just doing it for thought experiments. 1 ounce at 1,600 feet a second. Well, a 20 gauge is going to be about 3/4 of an ounce at the same velocity. 3/4 of an ounce is still a lot of lead. It's still a big hunk of lead. Oh, it's not 72 caliber. It's, what do we say? Or 71, 72 caliber. It's 61 or 62 caliber. It's still a big hunk of lead. It's still more than enough. So if we look at that, real vanilla load, something you can get at Walmart, is a 20 gauge, number 3 buck, 20 pellets. And that's out of a standard 2 3/4 inch shell. And then we got the a Federal True Ball, which I like True Ball rifled slugs out of a smoothbore barrel. They tend to do pretty well. I know I don't want to mansplain to you guys, but if you don't know, you're supposed to shoot Foster or Bernanke slugs out of a smoothbore, and you're supposed to shoot Sabo slugs out of a rifled shotgun. Rifle shotguns are a specialty thing if you live in a state that doesn't trust you to have real rifles and hunt deer only with shotguns. That's what they're for. We're not talking about that. But a good Foster style slug, true ball, I don't think is a gimmick. I think they're actually pretty accurate. And there's a Federal load, 3-inch, 3/4 ounce. That's a decent load, right? And then if we look at a Bernanke slug, this, again, remember we said we could get some real hot loads rivaling stuff that you get in a 12 gauge out of a 20 gauge. This is a Bernanke slug, which is a good solid slug, right? Good stuff. Bernanke slug, 1 ounce, which is about the same as a 12 gauge is going to be. It's just going to have higher sectional density, so it might penetrate even better. But a 1 ounce slug at 1476 feet per second for 2,120 foot-pounds. To give you just a rough idea, if you're not familiar with, if you haven't memorized foot-pounds for different calibers because you're not a ballistics nerd, in general, a hot 9mm is going to get you just over 400 foot-pounds. That load, the 20 gauge slug, is 2,120 foot-pounds, to give you an idea of the power. So just some thoughts there, right? If you want to go a little bit lighter, because you really don't need all that weight, Remington Slugger has a 20 gauge load, 1/2 ounce, which is still going to be 200 and something grains, because 1 ounce is 437 grains. So you're looking at 200 and some grains, right, at 1,800 feet a second. Yeah, you're giving up a little bit of weight, but I'd argue 1/2 ounce of lead is still a lot of lead, and you're going 1,800 feet a second, which is, again, you could get a really hot load, but that's hotter than a normal average hunting load for a 12 gauge slug. So just things to consider, right? And then obviously, there's all the other shot sizes that make the shotgun so versatile in the 20 gauge. Good loads in 7.5 shot. There's good loads in 6 shot. It has almost all the versatility. I'm not going to say as much versatility because there's a lot more loads available for the 12 gauge. But the 20 gauge is very, very versatile. So there is some real advantage to the 20 gauge. One thing I want to knock off the table, just that's always true because it's not, is that the 20 gauge has less recoil. It may not. And here's the reason why. The 20 gauge can have as much or more recoil sometimes, and oftentimes about as much as a 12 gauge. How can that be? Well, because they're generally lighter guns. I'd have to run the recoil numbers on this, right? But if, let's say, your average 12 gauge weighs 7 pounds, and I'm just throwing this out there. Average 12 gauge weighs 7 pounds, and you're shooting a 1 ounce slug at 1,600 feet a second. And your average 20 gauge weighs 6 pounds, and you're shooting a 3/4 ounce slug at 1,600 feet a second. Really, they're probably going to have similar recoil because the 20 gauge is lighter. Two things soak up the recoil when you pull the trigger: the gun or you. Right? The lighter the gun is, the more you have to take up that recoil. So don't just assume. Now, I think it is a better caliber for a lot of smaller frame people because for the similar recoil, you're going to need a lighter, handier, sleeker, svelter gun. It's a lot. And this is a big reason they're so popular with bird hunters. More than enough power. And if you're going to be walking around all day, not just the weight of the ammo, because you're probably not carrying that much for a day of bird hunting, unless you're just either like hunting in Argentina with no bag limits, or you just blasting away. That's not really a big concern. But carrying the gun all day at the ready, that is a big concern. So one of the reasons, again, among upland game hunters, the 20 gauge is real popular. But for a smaller shooter, right, using that 20 gauge, which is generally, all other things being equal, smaller and lighter platform with similar recoil, is a better option. But don't just think that, they really hate the recoil of the 12 gauge. I'm just going to get them a small little 20 gauge and it's going to have less recoil. Right? There are a lot of options for light loads in a 12 gauge, and there are less options for light loads out of 20 gauges. So you might, unless the weight holding the gun up is the problem, you might be better off with that shooter that's recoil shy, just going with a lighter load. There are plenty of reduced recoil buckshot loads and reduced recoil slugs for the 12 gauge. So you might be better off going that route, staying with the heavier gun and putting a lighter load in it, which is still going to be more than enough power than you need, than going to the 20 gauge. Now, the 20 gauge may be a good choice, but don't just necessarily assume, they hate the recoil of the 12 gauge, so I'm just going to go to a 20 gauge. That may be a bad choice. Because if you go, in general, a field load, bird hunting load for a 12 gauge is going to be 1 1/8 ounce. That's pretty standard, 1 1/8 ounce. Let's say at 1,300 feet a second. Well, if you go to a 20 gauge, and you can get 20 gauge, it shoots 1 1/8 ounce at about the same feet per second, and it's in a lighter gun, it's going to have more recoil, right? So don't just always assume that the 20 gauge is going to have less recoil, because that's not always the case. Anyway, those are some thoughts on the 20 gauge for survival as far as philosophy and my thoughts and some load comparison. I wish it was more popular in the tactical. Well, I wish the shotgun was more popular in the tactical world. I certainly wish the 20 gauge was more popular, but we have to deal in the world that we actually live in. So those are just some thoughts. I think the 20 gauge is plenty powerful enough for what most people are going to use it for deer hunting, for defense, more than powerful enough. That's not the main issue. The main issue is popularity, ammo availability, good, versatile survival platforms that it's built in. But anyway, those are some good, I think, things to mentally chew on if you're considering a 20 gauge. Your tactical verse of the day. Be anxious for nothing, but in everything with prayer and supplication, let your requests be made known to God. And the peace of God, which passes all understanding, will guard your hearts and minds in Christ Jesus. Thanks for listening, and have a blessed day.